And welcome into another episode of Flyers Files on BFA Sports. I'm your host, Kevin Durso. Great to be with you as we prepare for the end of 2025. Got a lot to talk about in a short amount of time tonight because there's a game coming up in just a short while, 2.5 hours. Some Flyers after dark, 10 o'clock start tonight against the Vancouver Canucks. So before we get into that and what will kickstart our next week that we will eventually discuss, I do want to first send out some reminders about where you can find everything at Kevin_Durso on the Twitter X platform, on Instagram, on YouTube, on TikTok. Find pre and post game reels and everything else that goes with my articles on 973ESPN.com. And join me for this continued journey as this Flyers season starts to approach the halfway point as we get into the show tonight. Couple different topics we're going to have on the table. There's a couple things about some specific players and beyond this season, or even shorter than that potentially. We're going to discuss the future of potentially two players going forward. We're also going to discuss the current road trip that the Flyers are on. Obviously, we were on last week to discuss kind of where everything stood at the holiday break. It was Christmas Eve. It was right up against the start of the holiday break. So the Flyers had come off of back-to-back wins in a back-to-back situation Monday, Tuesday. To go into the break on a high note, they come out of it, though, and lose to the Seattle Kraken 4-1 on Sunday night. So that's where things stand so far. We're not going to do a big weekend review. There was only one game played between the last show and this one, so I'm not going to do some huge weekend review. We're also not going to do the 3 stars of the week this week with only one game. There wasn't much to feature out of that game, to be honest. So we're going to skip over a couple of the typical weekly features of the Flyers Files podcast and discuss more around the team, some of the news that's going on, some of the rumors that are going on, and kind of get into that instead. So I want to start with the bits and pieces of this road trip because the Flyers are getting closer to the end of this trip, and it depends on where you want to kind of splice this thing. Where do you want to put an end to this discussion, so to speak? I've really been focused on after New Year's Eve. So they're going to play New Year's Eve tomorrow night against the Calgary Flames, and there will still be one game left on the road trip. But I'm not factoring that in necessarily to try to lump up like a record or anything like that. I really was focused in on they had 8 games left until the end of the calendar year when this stretch of games started. And I was focused on what their record could be out of that because of who they were playing. Like, I look at the team they're going to play to start 2026, the Edmonton Oilers, and they're in a different class than the other teams the Flyers have been facing. And I guess that's kind of what builds some frustration here because the Flyers through 6 of these games are 3-2-1. It's not a terrible record, but it has room to be so much better. And when you think about some of the losses, maybe we look a little differently at the Buffalo game now because Buffalo's on an absolute heater right now. But the way you lose in the shootout to the Rangers and the fact that could have easily shifted to a win, whether you finish the job in regulation with a 2-goal lead in the third period or win in overtime on one of your power plays or even win in the shootout, to be honest, it kind of didn't matter. That was an extra point out there that you let get away. Maybe there could have been more to the Buffalo game, all things considered. And certainly you let some missed opportunities get away from you and then had costly mistakes come into play when you played Seattle. And that's where that loss comes from. So I really wanted to see over the course of an 8-game stretch, a 5-2-1 record, and you're at 3-2-1, which basically puts it all out on the table for the next 2 games. You really need to try to get 2 points out of both of these if you can. And it's a challenge because Vancouver's been playing a lot better lately since making the trade with Quinn Hughes. They've looked a lot better. The Flyers kind of had to outweight that against, when they played Vancouver at home, that it was a close game through 2 periods, not exactly crisp, and then they really broke it open in the third period. And then you're going to play Calgary, who has definitely been on the rise lately, improved their play. So even though both of these teams are at the bottom of the standings, it doesn't take away from the fact that these are tough games. And you've already lost games. Like I said, the Buffalo game kind of shifts a little bit because Buffalo's climbed the standings a little bit more as this winning streak goes on. But you felt like you left something out there against the Rangers. Seattle is one of those teams that's in that bottom tier of teams in the standings. And, now you get Vancouver and Calgary in there. You took care of business against Vancouver last week. You also took care of business against Chicago, like you should. But you have an opportunity here. Like they actually won the first game of this against Montreal, was what, at least at the time, probably appeared to be the toughest game on paper. And now you won that one. You lost to Buffalo. You lost in a shootout to the Rangers. You bounced back with 2 more wins, and now you lost to Seattle on top of it. So you really want to make a good impression in this final 2 games to get as many points as possible, because it's interesting. Everybody around you keeps losing again, and it's not the way that you want to go into discussing a possible playoff push. If you're going to be a team like that, that's the thing to me. These 8 games were going to tell me, if you take care of business against the teams you're supposed to take care of business against and build up some cushion on the final playoff spot, then I can believe it a little bit more that you're going to be there at the end of the year, that you're going to be in position to do this. And I can buy into it a little bit more from my perspective of breaking down the team, because at least you're taking care of business against the teams you should. That starts it. Then if you can carry that over into, hey, do you beat Edmonton on the road? Do you beat a team like Anaheim that's been at the top of the standings? Do you beat Tampa somewhere down the, when you play them in a back-to-back? Other teams that will come along in this picture that are in the playoff picture, that you have to figure out whether or not you can compete with them down the line too. So at least at the start, going into the break, I felt pretty comfortable about that, because you got it back to where it kind of needed to be. Yeah, you lost a game in a shootout that you probably shouldn't have, and you had a game that you seemed like you were in control of for almost 2 periods, and that got away from you too. But a 3-1 record through 5 games, not bad, and certainly left the door open, because then what you're saying is that when you come back from the break, win 2 out of 3. That was it. But you lose the first one. So when you lose the first one, it really puts all of the pressure onto the next 2. And I'm not saying that the team is feeling that per se, because they don't have to go into games feeling like this is a must win. We need to take care of business here. But they should feel like they should feel like they have to take care of business without thinking standings implications. That's kind of the point. So these 2 games become a little bit more important, just because you want to finish a road trip strong. You want to get yourself further into that position and, build up some excitement for when you do come home, because you're going to come home for 4 straight games. Then you go back on the road for a little bit. You have another home game in there where you play the Rangers, which is usually always a lively building. Go back on the road for a week. Couple of road games are going to be scattered in with some home games toward the end of the month. And then you close things out with 3 straight home games. And then the Olympic break is here. And really, there's not much. There's only 2 games in February before the Olympic break. So the January schedule is really what we're looking at here beyond this. The games you play in January, add 2 on in early February, and that is going to be a marker for the next little bit of it. And you are already going to reach the halfway point of your schedule when you come home to play Anaheim on January 6th. So you're closing in on halfway. I believe that by the time once you finish playing that Anaheim game, you have another 13 games in January and 2 more in February before the Olympic break. So you'll have another 15 games to add on to the 41 you've played. So you're nearly going to be you're not going to be far away from 3/4 of the way through the season by the time the Olympic break hits. You're going to be at least 2/3 of the way through. And as such, you've got to be prepared that you are in the position still at that point. And then I think that creates more buy-in. So, whether you want to look at this as that whole picture, which includes the previous road games, the 4 games in a row they played, and talk about 3-2-1, whether you want to look at that they are now off to a 1-1 start on what is a 5-game road trip with 2 more to go before New Year's, and then the first game of 2026 that caps off this 5-game road trip. Sure, whatever way you want to look at it, but there's opportunity there to still establish your position. You haven't dropped below 3rd in the Metropolitan Division yet, and if you can keep getting wins, you'll only keep climbing. So it's important to still kind of establish that, especially if you want people to, like I said, you want people to be believers, take care of business against the teams that aren't as good as you and haven't been as good as you and are at the bottom of the standings. That's going to create the narrative that you can at least handle that part of your schedule. That you can, a team that's, if you're ranked 9th, 10th, 11th in the league and a team is ranked 14th or 15th, you might lose a game because it's close. You don't want to be losing games when you're 9th, 10th, 11th, and so on. You don't want to be in that kind of range and losing games to 26, 27, 28, and so on toward the bottom. And you've got a couple of games coming up against teams that are in that territory that you can get some points back, get back on the right track here after losing to Seattle, and set the stage for what could be a really big game against Edmonton to kind of see if you can't come back home with some more momentum as you try to continue down this path of being a contender. That's what will ultimately make a difference here. So that's what I'm looking for so far with this. And, by the time this team is prepared to return home, there's room for statements to be made to go along with what you did over a stretch of road games that you had the opportunity to gain points in, simply because you should have the better roster, even in the middle of what you're doing and trying to build. And Sunday didn't do it. So this is your chance to announce your presence even further, and you really have to take advantage. Let's get to one of the bigger topics that came up over the last weekend. And it's not necessarily a new topic by any stretch, but it's not something that's been at the forefront as much, but really has started to take shape. And that's the idea of a Christian Dvorak extension. And Dvorak obviously signed for 1 year, $5.4 million in the offseason as a free agent, and was really, between him and Dan Vladar, they were really the two big name free agents. Zegras was obviously the trade acquisition of the offseason, and that would have drawn more headlines. Dvorak's kind of been an under the radar type of player a little bit, just because Zegras has been so outstanding and was the headlining trade acquisition. Vladar has played above and beyond expectations, and as a goaltender and exceeding the expectations that he has, that's been a bigger offseason signing, it would appear. So you've got a steady player so far in Dvorak with 8 goals, 24 points in 36 games, or in 37, actually, after playing Seattle. And yet it just doesn't, he's not at the forefront of this, even though he's helping special teams on both sides. He's kind of been, he's been attached to Zegras almost the entire season in terms of being line mates. So there's a bit of a chemistry there. And, the question with with Dvorak's future has always been, is it going to be more than the 1 year deal? Were they going to move him at the trade deadline? Is it just a stopgap for the whole season? What is it? And look, I get that when you sign a guy like that, you're trying to stopgap everything so that you can be competitive, that you can have a veteran presence, and you don't have to get hooked for the future. And I understand, this was met, the idea that this could happen was really kind of met with a negative reaction from the fan base, because it was how typical of them, how typical of the Flyers to take a guy who is not a rebuild type player and get attached to him because he works well with the coach and because he's doing these types of things on the ice right now and he's got good numbers, and thinking it's going to replicate itself over and over again. The thing is, I'd like to know who people think is going to take Dvorak's place, other than saying that more or less this takes away the Trevor Zegras playing center experiment. I can't think of anybody else that this affects in the long-term picture. Jetlachenko has not, as the likely center candidate going forward, he has not done anything that indicates to me this guy's going to be in the NHL next year. Not yet. I don't see it at the junior level with him. He's not even having that great of a World Junior Championships with Team Canada right now. He's kind of been placed in a fourth line winger role, not even playing center. So how am I supposed to believe that he's going to take Christian Dvorak's role going forward immediately, starting next season? I'm not going to be able to believe that. Same thing with, Jack Nesbitt was just drafted. He's years away. Jack Berglund's having a really good World Junior Championships, but again, he's not even in North America yet to play pro. So he's got to get there before you can even think about those next steps. And, so I think that that's where this Dvorak conversation starts. Who do I have to play in the role that he's taken on when seemingly none of the guys in the system are ready? You can't tap into free agency for this one because by this point, with the way that the market has dried up, Dvorak's one of the 2 or 3 best centers on the market already as it is. So you're not exactly like it's funny to watch that as you go back to it and go, well, they could sign a free agent, and you come back to, well, one of the best options is Christian Dvorak. You already have Christian Dvorak on the roster. You're discussing whether or not to extend him or not. And if you go into free agency, one of the best options is that player himself. To me, the indication of one, having this get so far in the report that Elliot Friedman had during Hockey Night in Canada to say that the league feels like he's not even going to make it to market, that tells me there's progress. And the Flyers trying to get this done tells me that they might have a read on the trade market that isn't very good. And if they don't feel like they can swing a big offseason trade to get the center they've been looking for, then I just don't think they're going to take chances on opening up a bigger hole at center to begin with. Because if you took Dvorak out of the picture and Zegras isn't playing center for you, what is your center depth? Sean Couturier, who is not the player he used to be. Noah Cates, who kind of fits a role perfectly. And you've got Rodrigo Abels for now, and then you'd have to stopgap it some other way. It's not a good center group if you do that. So Dvorak at least makes it a little bit more passable that you can get by for another year or two like that. You probably are looking at trying to decipher negotiations between a 2-year deal and a 3-year deal in this. I know what people are going to think if it's a 3-year deal because it feels pretty like that feels long-term. A 2-year deal, I think, would be perfect, but you have to do what you have to do if you really want the player to stay. But I understand both sides of this. You're not sitting there saying, you're going to be overly eager about signing a guy who's turning 30 in February and, giving a roster spot to a player that is going to be in the later stage, the latter half of his career and has a specific role. It's not like this isn't, another guy. Like, everybody wants Zegras to be signed as soon as possible. Why? Because look at the production. And if that's the kind of production you can expect and he's 24 years old, why wouldn't you sign that as soon as possible? And there's probably more to it than that, both from player and team. Dvorak may be having a really good year now, but what happens if that's not what happens next year or the year after and you signed him and you're locked in? Like, certainly you have to be careful with like the idea of a no move clause or something like that. Like, you really want to have the flexibility to continue to shape your roster while using Dvorak as a stopgap, but you want to make sure that you also prepare yourself for anything that may come down the line. Like, just because the trade market may not be so encouraging now doesn't mean it won't be somewhere down the road. And maybe that doesn't change anything. Like, maybe what that does is just moves everybody down, and Cates still has his role. Couturier still has his role. Dvorak still has his role. And Abels is the guy who comes out when you acquire somebody. Like, maybe that's how you're thinking it too. I don't know. But it certainly sounds like this is going to get done sooner rather than later. And as such, it's just about trying to prepare for what the logic here is. Because the logic here is you don't have anybody in the system that's going to jump on this opportunity soon. Maybe you don't feel like there's good trades out there right now, and you're trying to make sure you already have the insurance policy just in case. And other than that, and again, it's the way that the free agent market went. You're probably not even thinking about this if some of the big names are out there, but they're not anymore. And because those big names have dried up, you're starting to think about, what can I do to still keep the team the way that it is and not sacrifice some of that competitiveness that they've had to keep a player that maybe in the short term bridges the gap between now and the long-term future with some of the prospects you have. So look, Dvorak's been a pretty, all things considered, been a solid player. You can't ignore that. He's had a pretty decent season, but, and maybe it says a lot that he's third on the team in scoring, third in points. I don't know. Maybe that says a lot about the rest of the team and the lack of depth at certain positions. Maybe it doesn't make a difference at all. And it's just, he's one of the better players this year. And then you're wondering whether he can replicate that for 2 more years or whatever it may be. I get the pushback on doing this, and I get what it feels like it kind of signifies. But I also don't have an obvious answer to a solution, because there's not an obvious player that it feels like is going to be available in a trade. There's certainly not an obvious choice in the free agent market. And there's definitely not much of an option internally. So without those three things, you start to lean more and more towards this is what you're going to have to do to maintain some depth at the center position while trying to remain competitive, while trying to finish off a rebuild. That's going to be the way that you get through it. At the same time that Elliot Friedman mentioned Christian Dvorak in an extension, he also brought up another player on that segment that I want to get into. And that was defenseman Egor Zamula. Now, Zamula just got placed on waivers not too long ago and cleared last week, goes to the Phantoms, and was there ahead of the roster freeze. And this had a lot to do with a couple things. Rasmus Ristolainen comes back from injury, so you have a need to open up a spot. Emil Andre got called up during the course of trying to balance out Ristolainen's injury, find the combinations you wanted, and it's really solidified his kind of, with his level of play, he's solidified being in a middle pairing role. Noah Juleson, kind of because of Ristolainen coming back, has comfortably moved into that seventh defenseman spot. So those are the three things that got rearranged that made Zamula more of an odd man out in that situation. And there's a bunch of things that kind of go along with this report that, because there was the idea was that there's a chance that there could be a termination involved if they wanted, if the agent wanted to try to kind of push for, can we just terminate the contract so we can go play somewhere else? Zamula has the same agent as Alexander Texier, who just got placed on waivers for contract termination and then signed with another team. So, Texier joined the Montreal Canadiens. So makes sense that could happen, and maybe that's what happens with Zamula. Maybe the answer is what the Flyers would prefer, which is to hang on to him and either see if they can't make a trade to get something in return, or hold on to him because he's an NHL defenseman at time. He's got enough NHL games as a player that if you needed to, for whatever reason, multiple injuries on the blue line, need a call up, have already exhausted maybe the next option in line. Because that was really the telling part of him, before he was placed on waivers, was when you needed a defenseman and it wasn't him, it was, we'll just call up Ty Murchison instead to fill the gap, and then watching it work for the Flyers. That kind of told you everything you needed to know about where Zamula was probably headed. So if not during the course of the season, and if not in the exact way that was described by terminating the contract and giving him a shot somewhere else, if the Flyers can't trade Zamula, I don't see them extending a qualifying offer to him if it means, trying to retain him in some way. I think that they would prefer whatever he can give until the end of the season if he's not able to play at any point, and then go into what maybe can happen. Is there a trade available? Does the agent continue to push for, let's terminate the contract, give him a fresh start somewhere else? Do you ride out the rest of the season with him in the minors for the most part, maybe with a call up if you really need something, a fill in somewhere, and then try to see if he can contribute to a playoff run for the minor league team? It's possible. So it's tough to say what they're going to do about this, right? Like, it's obvious he doesn't have much of a future with the team if you're getting lapped by a player that nobody would have put in that conversation at the start of the year. And that's more or less what Ty Murchison did. So if you're getting lapped by a player like that who has all of 3 NHL games to his name, that tells me that you're not going to be part of the long-term future. So whether this happens soon or whether it happens at the end of the season, I don't expect to see Egor Zamula much longer one way or the other. It might be, like I said, might be the end of the season in a few more months. It could be a matter of weeks or less if they go the termination route. So just different options that are there as we continue to move forward. And I want to get into some discussion before we get to the look ahead and we get to when the next episode will be. I do want to start to shift gears to the game tonight that the Flyers are going to play, taking on the Vancouver Canucks at 10 p.m. Little Flyers after dark for everybody. We haven't had many of these this year. It's been pretty infrequent that you got to, even some of the more traditional West Coast games. They played Seattle at 8 o'clock Eastern time on Sunday, not after 9 or 10 or whatever it would be. Typically, they're not going to play Edmonton like that. The game against Edmonton is going to be a 3:30 Eastern start. So it's not going to be that either. And you get the game tonight at 10, you get the game tomorrow at 9:30, and you really don't revisit this kind of schedule until the middle of January when you play a couple of games somewhat later, but again, it's going to feature a little bit of a unique schedule because they're going to play Vegas on January 19th, which is Martin Luther King Day. And as a result of that being a little bit of a different type of scheduling, that game is at 8:00 Eastern time, not a later time like it typically is when they play in Vegas. You get a couple of 9:00 starts in there when they play Utah and Colorado, but you really don't see this again until they go on one more. And again, when they go on one more trip out to the West Coast and play the California teams, Anaheim and LA are going to be after dark games, but San Jose, when they play on a Saturday afternoon, they're playing at 4:00 Eastern time. It's not that extreme. So there's really not as many of these games as you think. And so these games are usually a little bit, sometimes off the rails a little bit, because you're already, from a viewer's perspective, from the fans' perspective here, you're already off the rails a little bit trying to make it through a game like that. And then you have to, you're trying to make it through the game. The team is playing at an odd time. The team has also traveled to be in a different time zone, which can have an effect on you. So there's all sorts of things going. These games tend to be a little bit more wild than others when it comes to that. But you go into this game, the goalie matchup is the same. That was an interesting thought earlier today, that the Flyers are going with Dan Vladar in goal for this game. And listen, I'm not going to dispute Vladar getting a start. He's been the better goalie all season, for one. And you're looking for a bounce back game. You need a win. Vladar didn't. It's not that he didn't even have it on Sunday. He makes one mistake that was costly. The team made a costly mistake that led to another goal, and the other goals were both empty netters to cap the scoring off. But you really got what you could have asked for out of Vladar. You just didn't take advantage of your own opportunities enough when you had them, and maybe that game looks a little different. But I think that's what you're asking Vladar to do in this game, is one, bounce back, individually, as a team. You're also probably looking at that, Vladar started against Vancouver last week when they played each other and got the win, and was, kind of quietly very good, because the offense broke out in the third period and you got 4 goals in the period. And Vladar allowed 2, but not until later in the period, when the game was pretty much out of hand. By that point, it was already it was a 3-0 game when they scored the first one. It was 5-1 when they scored the second in the closing seconds of the game. So there really wasn't a lot that Vancouver could do in that game or could get really going, and the Flyers were much more in control throughout that, and once it kind of got out of hand. And you kind of need to set the stage for the possibility of what you did before the holiday break coming out of it this time. Can you win a game against Vancouver that you would like to believe you deserve to win just on paper? Can you beat Calgary this time? Calgary came in as the worst team in the league when they did and made their visit to Philadelphia, and you lost to them because it was a rather lifeless kind of game. Can you do that this time on the road, and kind of, even though it's a game that you're going to look at where they are and say, you shouldn't have to think they're going to lose that game. I do want to see them put it together and not have what happened, the game, whether it's the game, kind of the game against Seattle, the game against Calgary the first time around. You don't want repeat performances of those where you're not quite completely with it. The execution is off. The details are off in your game. So those are all things to consider as you watch this game and you go into the next one. You're playing a back-to-back. You get a couple of days in between. The team is taking a day off on New Year's Day from anything, no skating, because of the back-to-back. And then they're going to prepare themselves for, they'll have a practice on Friday to lead into Saturday's afternoon game, and then go from there as they get ready to return home. So that it kind of sets the stage for everything to come. So let's go into the look ahead, actually, and start to talk about this upcoming schedule. And it starts, as mentioned, with tonight's game, 10:00 start against the Vancouver Canucks. They're back on the ice again tomorrow against the Calgary Flames. 9:30 start time there. Then that little break, they go play the Edmonton Oilers at 3:30 on Saturday. Back home against the Anaheim Ducks on Tuesday, January 6th, for a 7:00 start. Special game that night, too. That's going to be the Ed Snyder Legacy game, as the Flyers make their debut in 2026 on home ice. and hopefully are still in a playoff spot at that time. Hopefully are still building on what they've started and give the fans a reason to get hyped up about the possibilities, to really be excited about what's to come. I mean, by that point, you're at the halfway point of the season. Make some, give some more excitement to this. One of the cool things about the last game that the team played prior to the holiday break at home was it was a packed house. And whether that had to do with I saw some ideas floated around that maybe that had to do with they didn't host a Black Friday game this year. So the holiday game is the one that everybody kind of poured into to really try to make sure that they were at or whatever. Or maybe it was just the timing of the year. The team's interesting. You've gotten to this time of year. School's letting out. Maybe more families felt like they could go to this game or something like that. And it was a great crowd for that Vancouver game the previous Monday, right? Their last home game before the holiday break. And now they come out of the holiday break. They've lost a game to Seattle, and they really could use that bounce back effort against Vancouver, and then to keep it going against Calgary and Edmonton as they go into Alberta, and then get ready to come home as well and play the next 4 games after that on home ice, starting with that game against Anaheim. Our next episode, I will be joining you next in another week, plus a day, actually, on Wednesday, January 7th, 11 a.m., as per usual this time. We kind of rearranged the schedule a little bit over the last couple of shows just to try to accommodate a couple different things. The holidays, different unique schedules, things like that. So hopefully going to get back to some consistency with this in the morning, at the usual time. Not going to promise anything given the way sometimes the schedule can be. There is a game, obviously the team plays the Tuesday night before that, so we'll see how close we are to that. But that is where we're going to leave this one after a lot of good discussion, talking some contract situations, possible extensions, possible terminations, possible changes to the roster in general. Also talking about how this team has fared so far on the road trip and what that could mean going forward as they try to continue to maintain what they've started so far for most of the first half. They've been consistently in a playoff spot for almost the entirety of the season. They're going to probably reach the new year in a playoff spot. And then can they continue that for another handful of weeks, get to the Olympic break, and still be in position to make a possible run? There's not going to be a lot of time left once they come back there. And then there's going to be a lot of games in a short period of time. And I'll be here with you to go along for the journey as the Flyers continue the 2025-2026 season, the 2025 portion, wrapping up in another couple of days. 2 more games to go. It starts tonight with the Flyers taking on the Canucks. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Flyers Files podcast. Real quick before we get out of here, where can you find me? On the Twitter X platform, on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, at Kevin_Durso. All my updates are there. All my videos, the preview and post-game reels are there. Written content over for 973ESPN.com. And don't forget that the Flyers Files podcast is here on BFA Live Sports, and along with a bunch of other great shows, right? Nernshaw Radio, Trust the Mics, covering the Sixers, Now Batting for the Phillies, covering the Phillies, and everything going on with them, and more to come as we get ready to turn the page on 2025 and go into 2026 with hopefully a lot of high hopes going forward. And I'm not using that just as a reference to where the Flyers are. Maybe that's a little bit of a nod to the Phillies as well. Hopefully some good things to come beyond the early months of the year where the Flyers and Sixers are kind of the focus. The Eagles are still in there too, obviously, and then get into baseball season over the spring and summer, and another new campaign for the Flyers and Sixers again as the calendar just continues to move along. So thank you for joining me tonight on this show. Thank you for joining me through anything over the course of 2025. I greatly appreciate the support and the viewership and the readership and everything that goes along with it. Wishing everybody a happy new year. Stay safe out there if you're going out on New Year's Eve. And we'll see you on the other side in 2026 for the next episode as the Flyers will wrap up this post-holiday road trip and get ready to come home. They'll actually have played a home game by the time we're back with you, but get ready for more home games as the push for the Olympic break comes next. Once again, I'm Kevin Durso. This has been the latest episode of the Flyers Files podcast on BFA Sports.